In September 2025, Kathmandu once again erupted. Streets filled with barricades and fire, young protesters surrounding parliament, and a prime minister forced to resign under pressure. The military was deployed in the capital for the first time in years. It looked like a nation on the edge of collapse. Yet as the clashes faded, the anger did not disappear. It only sank back into daily life, mixed with unemployment, inflation, and a sense that nothing truly changes. By Transparency International's 2024 Index, Nepal ranked 107th of 180 nations, scoring just 34 out of 100, evidence that corruption remains deeply entrenched. After burning parliament, are these young citizens a long-term threat to the system, or just another wave elites can absorb? We'll map what changed in the streets, the courts, and the economy, and why the army now matters more than ever. To begin, we need to understand why corruption became Nepal's permanent condition. The roots of Nepal's corruption. Nepal's corruption crisis is not just a story of politicians misbehaving. It is the skeleton of the political system itself. International observers point to it year after year, and the 2024 figures are unambiguous. Nepal scored 34 out of 100 on Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, ranking 107th out of 180 countries. Any score under 50 signals serious governance failures. For citizens, though, the problem isn't just a number. It appears in the form of pothole-riddled roads that collapse after one monsoon despite millions budgeted for repairs, in hospitals where equipment never arrives, and in schools where students share broken desks because funds disappeared somewhere higher up. The statistics simply confirm what people experience every day. These frustrations trace back to the political order shaped after the monarchy was abolished in 2008. The transition was celebrated with hopes of a more accountable, representative government. Instead, unstable coalitions and constant reshuffles made Nepal one of the most politically unstable states in Asia, with 14 governments in less than 2 decades and no prime minister serving a full mandate. Without strong institutions, patronage networks quickly filled the vacuum. Cabinets were divided not only for governance, but also for distributing contracts, appointments, and state resources. Rather than dismantling the old habits of favoritism, the Republic re-inscribed them into its foundation. People soon came to see ministries as gateways to wealth rather than levers of change. Development contracts became lucrative prizes to reward party loyalists. Oversight agencies existed on paper, but were often led by individuals tied to the very parties they were supposed to monitor. Scandals became routine. The OMNI medical procurement scandal during the pandemic, where vital supplies were overpriced through opaque deals, or the Tax Settlement Commission case, which involved billions siphoned from state revenue. In each instance, headlines sparked outrage, but prosecutions were rare and convictions even rarer. Investigations drifted into endless technical delays until public attention waned. The effect was corrosive, especially for the younger generation. In recent years, social media brought sharp focus to the gulf between ordinary citizens and political elites. One viral image, showing the son of a senior politician posing in front of a stacked Christmas tree of luxury brand boxes, fueled the anger. For many, it symbolized everything that had gone wrong. While ordinary families struggled with inflation and unemployment, the children of leaders flaunted lives funded by political privilege. Memes spread faster than official statements, and hashtags mocking Nepal's Nepo kids became rallying cries online. This pattern is what scholars call institutionalized corruption, and in Nepal it is especially entrenched. What makes it different from isolated scandals is the system's built-in resistance to change. Even when reformist rhetoric dominates campaigns, or when commissions produce detailed reports on corruption, enforcement collapses at the crucial stage. Oversight bodies staffed with politically connected officials block serious investigations. Reports accumulate without consequences. Anti-corruption drives are applied selectively, weaponized against rivals rather than allies. In short, enforcement is compromised because the enforcers themselves are invested in the same networks that profit from inaction. cycle is predictable. Governments promise reform, commissions are announced, and declarations of transparency echo in Parliament. But when it comes to implementation, laws are sidestepped, loopholes are exploited, and accountability never follows. By design, the process offers appearances of movement without any substantial shift in outcomes. People watch familiar scandals unfold under new prime ministers just as they did under the old ones. Proof that what drives this continuity is not the personality of leaders, but the structure guiding their incentives. Access to office brings control over contracts, licensing, and appointments, and this in turn sustains party machines. That is why reforms on the surface prove shallow. Deeper institutional changes that could genuinely restructure these incentives have never been attempted seriously. Over time, this system has drained public confidence. Every collapse of government and emergence of a replacement comes with promises of clean governance. Younger voters in particular responded with energy. They joined movements, organized campaigns, and poured into the streets with determination that this time corruption would face true reckoning. But the persistence of broken promises has left many disillusioned. Some chose survival strategies outside politics, like seeking work abroad and sending remittances home. Others stayed engaged but carry heavier skepticism, expecting the next government to announce familiar pledges and deliver familiar disappointments. By 2025, the picture is clear. Despite new constitutions, reconfigured alliances, waves of mass mobilization, and high-profile resignations, Nepal remains anchored in the lower ranks of global corruption standings. Its score in 2024 matched the same levels of dysfunction seen years earlier. The evidence is not in dramatic reversals, but in stagnation, modest shifts of 1 or 2 points year on year that quickly flatten into the same underwhelming trajectory. Efforts frequently proclaimed by elites, the very actors invested in the system, rarely advance far enough to build trust. This resilience of corruption reveals something uncomfortable. It is not a flaw at the edges of Nepal's politics, but the organizing principle inside it. Patronage, weak oversight, and compromised enforcement ensure the cycle sustains itself. Citizens have learned that neither rotating prime ministers nor passing new laws by themselves are enough to disrupt the machinery that protects graft. Structural incentives continue to reward those who feed the networks over those who challenge them. This is the pattern that set the stage for eruptions of mass anger. Younger Nepalese, more connected and more impatient, sought to upend it. They turned outrage into organized resistance, shifting the conversation from online criticism to physical demonstrations. At its peak, it seemed as though the entrenched system might finally face a genuine challenge. The next part of this story follows what came after that defiance, when anger moved from the statistics of corruption to the firelit streets of Kathmandu. The aftermath of the protests. What followed in late 2025 was one of the most disruptive episodes in Nepal's recent history. The protests that began in September had ignited around the government's decision to ban 26 social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and X among them. Officials claimed the new regulations were about tax compliance, but on the streets, the move was immediately read as censorship, an attempt to silence dissent. Young Nepalese, many still in school uniforms, rallied in front of Parliament, chanting for the right to speak and organize online. For them, the ban was not simply about apps. It symbolized a government more invested in tightening control than in addressing the corruption and economic stagnation that defined their daily lives. At first, these crowds gathered in largely peaceful waves, holding placards, live streaming speeches, and using encrypted messaging apps to maintain coordination. Then came the second stage, confrontation. Police fired tear gas and then live rounds into the chanting crowds, turning what began as rallies into violent clashes. By the third stage, anger boiled over. Government buildings, including the Parliament and the Supreme Court, were set ablaze. Images of young protesters torching barricades and scattering as curfews fell spread across foreign news outlets, while Nepali social feeds filled with footage of both brutality and defiance. In the chaos, dozens were killed, hundreds injured, and the military imposed a nationwide curfew. Early reports suggested at least 19 people had been killed, though figures varied as the situation evolved. The shock lay not only in the violence, but also in who filled the streets. Alongside older students and young professionals were teenagers, many still balancing backpacks on their shoulders, standing at the front lines. Social media became the lens through which much of Nepal experienced the upheaval. Hashtags like Nepo Kids resurfaced with renewed force, drawing a connection between the ruling elite and the frustrations that had been simmering for years. Memes framed the protests as a generational revolt, tapping into global conversations on privilege and accountability. Seen from a distance, Nepal looked much like Sri Lanka in 2022 or Bangladesh in 2024, countries where youth-led demonstrations had brought governments to their knees. But while the scale of outrage mirrored these examples, the long-term aftermath developed differently. In Kathmandu, momentum ebbed as quickly as it rose. Once the curfew and military presence took hold, protests lost their coherence. What remained was a state shaken, a leadership reeling, but a system remarkably intact. The months that followed revealed why. On the surface, the ruling parties scrambled to show they were correcting course. The Prime Minister resigned, several ministers were forced out, and urgent speeches promised transparency and reform. Parliamentary sessions echoed with language about accountability, fairness, and better oversight. Officials sought to convince both citizens and the international community that concrete measures were finally underway. In practice, though, reforms were narrower than the rhetoric. Restrictions on donations appeared impressive until allies of politicians funneled funds through family foundations, avoiding scrutiny. Campaign spending caps made headlines, but ruling parties justified extravagant cultural outreach programs that doubled as election rallies. Newly established watchdog institutions were touted as breakthroughs, yet quietly staffed with individuals chosen through cross-party deals, leaving them compromised from the start. Promises of independence dissolved into business as usual. Many observers argued this was almost predictable. Networks that had spent years entwining business, politics, and bureaucracy proved adept at surviving pressure. Protesters could force figures out of office, but replacements slipped easily into the same channels of patronage. Commissions compiled thick reports diagnosing mismanagement, but enforcement collapsed. Courts dragged on proceedings until anger faded. Leaders quickly returned to familiar strategies, drafting codes of conduct, holding public consultations, pledging progress, then continuing as before. Still, something had shifted. Even if the protests delivered little structural change, they reshaped civic culture. Dismissive rhetoric about the youth caring only for entertainment no longer held. Footage of schoolchildren chanting outside police lines forced the public to acknowledge that frustration had spread across generations. Political parties that once ignored digital movements now tracked hashtags and memes as potential warning signs. For the first time, parliamentary speeches openly addressed Nepo baby culture, a recognition that images of privilege and wealth could ignite unrest as easily as corruption scandals. Yet disillusionment grew at the same time. As 2025 wore on and emergency measures gave way to ordinary politics, optimism bled away. Citizens who had seen friends beaten, arrested, or killed began asking whether the sacrifices had been worth it. Legislation passed, commissions were formed, and officials resigned. But in neighborhoods across Kathmandu, everyday corruption looked unchanged. Parents still found it necessary to pay bribes for school admissions. Contractors still cut corners on roads that washed away in the monsoon. Hospitals still lacked basic supplies. The irony was hard to escape. The protests had been powerful enough to force out top leaders and bring the army into the streets, but not strong enough to erode the incentive structures that sustained corruption. Every reshuffle left the same core networks intact. Each new pledge of reform met with even greater skepticism. Younger activists who had once framed demonstrations as watershed moments began to describe them instead as cycles. Sudden surges of outrage, government promises, minimal implementation, and a return to cynicism. For many young people, the personal toll was decisive. Some shifted their focus away from politics altogether, concentrating instead on securing jobs abroad. Migration, already widespread, increased as more graduates saw few opportunities at home. Others remained engaged, but with a tempered sense of expectations. For them, protest had become less about triggering systemic transformation and more about showing elites that citizens could still disrupt, even if permanence was elusive. By the end of 2025, the aftermath of the protests left Nepal at a crossroads. The state had survived the most serious youth uprising in decades, but survival came at a cost, an even wider gap between words and reality. Leaders argued they had responded with reforms, yet the system appeared almost untouched beneath the surface. Citizens now measured progress less by promises than by lived experience, and increasingly by data from international watchdogs. That is where the next question emerges. If rallies, curfews, and casualties revealed one truth on the ground, what did the global measures of governance tell us? To answer that, we have to look at how Nepal appeared when the world ranked corruption at the start of 2025. Nepal in the 2025 corruption rankings. In early 2025, Transparency International's annual Corruption Perceptions Index once again placed Nepal in a position that reflected the frustrations of its people. The country scored 34 out of 100 and ranked 107th of 180 nations, the exact same spot it had occupied in 2018. On the CPI's 0-100 scale, where 0 signals extreme corruption and 100 represents a clean system, Nepal's score leaves it firmly marked as having serious governance problems. For many Nepalis, the numbers only confirmed what they already lived every day. Despite mass protests, changes in leadership, and years of official promises, the international reputation of their political system remained frozen. This stagnation is not unique to Nepal. Globally, scores have flatlined for more than a decade, with the average CPI sitting at 43 for 12 years straight. Many countries struggle to translate anti-corruption slogans into credible reforms. Yet Nepal's persistence in the low 30s reinforces what citizens repeat with weary certainty. Nothing changes, no matter who governs. The youth massed in Kathmandu in 2018 and again in 2025 believed political turnover would break entrenched habits. The scoreboard tells a harsher truth. Perceptions of corruption are identical to where they stood before the sacrifices and street battles. These international rankings matter not just because they are symbolic, but because they reflect what bureaucrats, business owners, and citizens actually experience when dealing with the state. A stagnant score signals that bribes remain a prerequisite for basic services. Investors and officials surveyed for the CPI continue to describe Nepal as a place where rules depend on connections, contracts go to the politically connected, and scandals rarely meet real consequences. When scandals like the OMNI medical procurement case or the Tax Settlement Commission fade without decisive trials, they reinforce the perception that protection for elites is the true law of the land. For ordinary Nepalis, a CPI score of 34 is not an abstraction. It translates into specific, frustrating encounters. At hospitals, families still report being asked for unofficial fees to secure care. A business license still requires knowing an insider or quietly paying a middleman. Property registration, school enrollment, and police reports all are transactions vulnerable to informal payments. The CPI numbers carry weight precisely because they mirror the daily calculations people make when they approach government offices. Rankings remain low because nothing in those habits has changed. Nepal's neighbors and peers show how striking this stagnation is. Countries like Turkey and Algeria share Nepal's 2024 score of 34. Brazil, despite its sprawling Operation Car Wash scandal, sits slightly higher with 36. These are states often cited internationally as plagued by weak enforcement and deep-seated patronage networks. Nepal sitting alongside them speaks volumes. Unlike Georgia, which rebuilt institutions in the 2000s and sharply improved its CPI standing, or Indonesia, which for a time sustained progress through an empowered anti-graft commission, Nepal's position has been effectively unmoved. Change in Kathmandu has not matched the kind of institutional renewal other governments have attempted, however fragile their results. The pattern of cosmetic reform followed by inertia is visible inside the numbers themselves. Whenever change is announced, whether limits on political donations, new commissions, or updated codes of conduct, the observable impact has been negligible. Enforcement bodies remain led by insiders who owe their placement to political favor. Commissions announce investigations, publish reports, and then fall silent as cases drag out. The effect is cumulative. Both citizens and investors surveyed by Transparency International conclude year after year that institutions function essentially as they did before, regardless of reform headlines. It is important to note that the CPI measures perceptions, not a forensic count of bribes exchanged. But those perceptions stem from real interactions, repeated constantly across public services. If stakeholders across the board report that nothing has shifted, it is because their on-the-ground experiences lead them to expect the same outcomes. When numbers hold steady at 34, the message is that Nepalese and outsiders alike see no evidence of structural change. That public understanding matches the lived reality on the streets. One consequence of these rankings is the skepticism of international donors and lenders. Nepal relies heavily on external assistance for everything from infrastructure to education to health, but low CPI scores raise red flags for oversight. Partners hesitate to funnel money directly into state institutions. Instead, funds are routed through international NGOs or parked in monitored programs, slowing delivery timelines and undermining national ownership. For development planners in Kathmandu, this is more than a blow to prestige. It is a practical constraint that hampers their ability to build long-term projects, until donor confidence rises, which will only happen when corruption is credibly addressed. Nepal's development suffers bottlenecks directly linked to its CPI standing. Inside the country, the effect is just as corrosive. Citizens see reform announcements as performance. Each government that claims to be different is tested by whether ordinary people notice improvements in how offices function. To date, surveys for the CPI reflect that they do not. Nepalese measure progress not in press conferences, but in whether bribes are still required for a hospital bed or whether politically connected firms still dominate every contract bid. Years of repetition have created a cynicism that filters even legitimate reform proposals through suspicion. When Transparency International publishes another score in the mid-30s, it becomes a vivid shorthand for that pessimism. The 2025 CPI confirms that even after historic upheavals, Nepal's governance indicators remain locked. This outcome signals not only the depth of institutional capture, but also the political will, or lack thereof, behind reform efforts. Structural change remains either unattempted or quickly undermined. The cycle of resignation, replacement, and renewed promises has not collapsed the networks that sustain corruption. Instead, each reshuffle seems to rewire the same circuits with new names. For Nepalese, this is more than a number. It is a reminder that protest, however dramatic, does not automatically reset entrenched systems. The structures behind corruption are resilient enough to withstand both street uprisings and international scrutiny. Unless enforcement mechanisms are insulated from political bargaining, the CPI will continue to reflect not only external judgment, but also the everyday frustrations of citizens. The release of the figures at the start of 2025 therefore lands as both confirmation and indictment. It confirms what people long suspected, that Nepal remains in the same bracket of deeply troubled states, and it indicts the political leadership that has cycled through office without producing measurable improvement. Citizens are left asking not only why reforms fail, but who, if anyone, is truly steering the state toward integrity. This question sets the stage for the next concern. After years of resignations, shifting alliances, and hollow promises, where does real political authority in Nepal now reside? Political leadership in 2025. In 2025, the question of political leadership in Nepal has grown sharper than ever. After the September protests forced Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli to resign, the spotlight moved to Sushila Karki. On September 12, she was sworn in as Nepal's interim Prime Minister, the country's first woman to hold the post. Her appointment was extraordinary not just because of who she was, a former Chief Justice with a reputation for integrity, but because of how she was chosen. Young activists and citizens, fed up with traditional parties, organized an unprecedented online poll on Discord to select her as a compromise figure. In the eyes of many, it was a direct rejection of the old guard and an appeal for new legitimacy. The symbolism was powerful. For weeks, crowds had demanded leaders not tied to the patronage networks that fueled corruption. Choosing Karki seemed like a way to turn protest energy into leadership without depending on discredited parties. Yet this moment of optimism immediately collided with the realities of Nepali politics. Cabinets are not built solely by new votes of confidence. They are stitched together through backroom negotiations among factions that have spent decades bargaining for slices of power. Even with Karki as a reform-minded figure, her government still had to distribute ministries to keep rival groups on board. This reliance on coalition arithmetic defines decision-making in Nepal's parliamentary system. Ministries are awarded not to the most able candidates, but to whichever faction offers support or threatens defection. A Minister of Health might lose their seat within months if another party angles for the portfolio. A Transport Minister may not last long enough to finalize a single infrastructure blueprint before the coalition reshuffles again. No Prime Minister has completed a full 5-year term since Nepal became a republic in 2008, and Karki's interim government fit into this pattern of impermanence. The churn prevents continuity, ensuring that long-term reforms collapse before they can take root. The effect is obvious. Policy is guided by survival rather than vision. Leaders speak of curbing corruption or reforming public services, but more often they are calculating whether a proposal could fracture the coalition. Even high-profile issues, judicial independence, campaign finance reforms, or investigations into grand corruption are shelved to avoid triggering walkouts from nervous partners. For many Nepalis, political leadership is now a rotating door, good for headlines, bad for planning. Public sentiment reflects this frustration. Karki inspired a brief sense of possibility, but citizens quickly recognized that her cabinet still operated within the same bargaining logic. Speeches about reform carried weight initially, yet cynicism set back in when citizens saw no change in daily encounters with offices, courts, or contractors. A government that cannot last is, by definition, a government that cannot deliver. The cycle produces a paradox. New leaders emerge in moments of protest or collapse, but once inside the system, they are cornered by the same incentives that doomed their predecessors. More importantly, the fragility of civilian authority creates space for another actor, the security forces. The line of succession from parliament now runs parallel to a line of discipline from the army and police. Every time civilian coalitions weaken, it is the military that imposes order in the streets, as it did during the September 2025 curfews. Each collapse of authority reinforces the impression that while cabinets may change weekly, only the armed forces guarantee stability. This reliance is predictable, and it shapes how Nepali leadership is understood at home and abroad. Weak governments surrounded by strong security institutions. This balancing act has become routine. Politicians bargain inside parliament while soldiers manage unrest outside. Protesters demanding structural reform watch their leaders reshuffle posts, but rarely see anyone held accountable in court. When scandals arise, whether inflated contracts, missing funds, or procurement fraud, commission reports appear, but they rarely lead to prosecution. Government leaders promise investigations, then quietly stall them once coalition partners object. In this environment, each prime minister resembles more a caretaker than a leader, holding office just long enough to shield allies before the next turnover. Even Sushila Karki, with her unusual mandate and symbolic break from party politics, faced these constraints. Her cabinet included reformist figures, but still offered important seats to established factions. Announcements about transparency filled headlines, but the system beneath them remained intact. International observers noted the symbolism of her leadership, yet on the ground little shifted. Without time or mandate to pursue deeper change, her government carried the traits of all those before: temporary, constrained, and dependent on keeping rivals appeased. For citizens watching, it reinforced the sense that leadership in Nepal is never about ideas, but about endurance. People no longer expect governments to achieve policy goals. They expect them to survive through one crisis until the next collapse. Speeches on unity or reform sound like background noise in a rhythm everyone already knows. Instability, resignation, replacement, and repetition. Youth activists, who had once imagined protests could push a decisive break, found themselves facing the same cycle dressed in a different face. This dynamic raises an uncomfortable truth. Political fragility has become more than dysfunction. It has become a strategy. Instability itself shields elites who benefit from it. By the time scrutiny builds over scandal, the administration has changed hands and accountability resets to zero. The revolving door protects those at the top while draining the energy of those demanding reform. Protest cycles become pressure valves rather than catalysts of transformation. In 2025, political leadership in Nepal can best be described as rule through compromise and survival. A transitional figure like Sushila Karki could symbolically break from tradition, but she still needed to navigate the same entrenched networks. Cabinet seats remain bargaining chips. Decisions tilt toward caution rather than boldness. Civilian governments operate under constant risk of collapse, and citizens see in their leaders not stability, but fragility. The result is that while the identity of the Prime Minister may shift, the experience of government remains unchanged. No enduring reforms emerge from systems designed to reset with each turnover. Instead, Nepalese see their leaders as placeholders, buying time, waiting for the next crisis to erupt. Over time, this has hardened public skepticism and deepened reliance on non-political solutions, whether through the courts, external donor oversight, or the security forces. What this means for ordinary citizens is that politics does not feel like a tool for solving problems. It feels like a cycle maintained for its own sake. Leadership is measured not in laws passed or reforms enforced, but in whether a coalition can stagger through another confidence vote. While elites maneuver for portfolios, the daily struggles of Nepalese remain untouched. Hospitals still run short of supplies, schools still lack funding, prices still climb beyond wages. Leadership at the top feels detached from life at the bottom. And it is here that the story shifts. Political fragility has costs not only for institutions, but for everyday people. While parties bargain for ministries and power, ordinary citizens are left to feel the economic strain in their households, their towns, and their futures. Economic strain on ordinary citizens. The lived experience of economic strain in 2025 is measured less in statistics than in how it shapes daily burdens for households. For ordinary Nepalese, corruption connects directly to survival. A hospital bill made higher because basic supplies must be purchased privately. A road that collapses only months after completion. An education delayed because classrooms lack resources. Families encounter these distortions constantly, and they accumulate into unemployment, rising prices, and limited prospects for the young. One of the clearest indicators of these pressures is the reliance on remittances. In 2024, money sent home by Nepalese working abroad accounted for roughly 1/3 of total GDP, making Nepal one of the most remittance-dependent economies in the world. Millions of citizens now labor in the Gulf states, Malaysia, South Korea, and India. The fact that so many leave does not reflect ambition for adventure, but the stark absence of reliable opportunities at home. The domestic labor market is constrained by favoritism and bribes, and decent jobs are often reserved for the well-connected. For the majority, migration is not a choice. It is the only available path to stability. The scale of international labor movement can be seen in youth unemployment rates. By 2024, unemployment among Nepalese aged 15 to 24 stood at about 20.8%. Behind that figure lies a common reality: graduates completing their studies with confidence in their skills, only to face months or years without work. Many accept insecure, temporary positions far below their qualifications, but just as many abandon hope in the domestic market entirely. The student in engineering who finds herself laboring in Qatar, or the economics graduate serving tables in Dubai, has become a familiar story. Migration is a coping strategy for individuals, but at the national level, it has hollowed out the workforce and reshaped communities. In rural districts, the impact of outmigration is stark. Villages are marked by the absence of young men and women, leaving grandparents to care for grandchildren. Seasonal festivals and planting cycles take place without the demographic that once carried them out. In Kathmandu, the pattern appears in different ways. Young people crowd manpower agencies and language training centers, waiting for documentation that will allow them to leave. Economically, these movements sustain households, but socially, they drain the country of its most capable workforce. The problem is not only the absence of work, but the inequities built into how resources are distributed. The wealthiest 10% of the population control a disproportionate share of the country's wealth, using political networks to expand through contracts and licenses. At the other end, the poorest 40% hold minimal assets, surviving primarily on remittances or unstable labor. This inequality does more than widen gaps in income. It fuels resentment. When elites celebrate expensive weddings, while nearby communities pool donations for emergency medical care, the contrast is impossible to ignore. Economic injustice merges with political frustration, reinforcing the anger that drives people to the streets. Corruption distorts investment as well. Public funds budgeted for development often become vehicles of enrichment for contractors tied to political patrons. Oversight is weak, bidding processes are manipulated, and procurement is inflated. Citizens see the results: roads that wash away in the monsoon, hospitals forced to ration outdated equipment, and schools still lacking desks years after construction money was released. Rather than multiple examples, the overall outcome can be stated simply. Corruption turns public projects into repetitive delays and cost overruns, while ordinary people absorb the consequences in poor services and higher living costs. Inflation sharpens the burden. Families report spending more each month for basic goods, rice, cooking oil, vegetables, even as wages fail to keep pace. With corruption feeding inefficiency in supply chains, rumors circulate of deliberate shortages staged for profit. The poorest households are hit first. Meals reduced, heating rationed, children withdrawn from school to cut costs. Those with remittance inflows can sometimes buffer these shocks, but those without depend on loans taken informally at punishing interest rates. Rather than building avenues of progress, the system entrenches cycles of debt and marginalization. Structural weaknesses also limit the growth of industries that could provide alternatives to migration. Hydropower and tourism are frequently touted as key sectors for Nepal's future, alongside light manufacturing and infrastructure expansion. Yet contracts stall, projects freeze in disputes, and promises outpace delivery. Households are left with broken expectations. Electricity shortages despite plans for vast generation, rural economies waiting for industrial parks that never begin construction, tourism campaigns undermined by inadequate airports and transport. The pattern is repetition without resolution, visible in stalled job creation that compounds unemployment woes. In this environment, the dependence on foreign earnings paradoxically sustains the very system that forces people to leave. Families survive because their sons and daughters remit salaries from abroad. Governments manage imports thanks to those inflows of foreign currency. The balance of payments stabilizes, bankruptcies are softened, and the cycle continues. On the surface, the inflows create an image of resilience. But the deeper story is fragility. Nepal maintains stability only by exporting its workforce, not by providing viable work at home. This dependence has long-term consequences beyond the economy. Migration reshapes aspiration itself. For a growing share of the population, career planning no longer revolves around achievement in Nepal, but around which training will secure a contract overseas. Education, in that sense, becomes less a tool for national development and more a ticket out. What remains at home is a sense of resignation that politics cannot or will not build institutions able to support domestic opportunity. The irony is that remittances simultaneously sustain household consumption and stall reforms. As long as inflows keep the economy afloat, political leaders face fewer immediate pressures to fix what sends workers abroad to begin with. The human cost of this reliance is carried by families. Parents and children, separated for years, exchange their relationships for survival. Workers endure dangerous conditions and long contracts outside Nepal, returning home only intermittently. Corruption amplifies this by undermining labor protections, with recruitment agencies charging illegal fees and officials turning a blind eye. Instead of a system that empowers citizens, the combined weight of corruption and weak opportunity leaves them navigating a marketplace of vulnerability. Across society, the result is an uneasy equilibrium. Everyday life continues, powered by wages earned abroad, even though the foundations of the domestic economy remain stagnant. Year after year, politicians repeat slogans about jobs and opportunities, but citizens increasingly judge the promises by whether people are still compelled to leave. Their conclusion is consistent. Migration remains constant because little has changed at home. Taken together, these pressures highlight a paradox. Nepal appears stable enough to sustain itself, but lacks the structures to secure a future rooted in domestic growth. Remittances prop up consumption, unemployment forces migration, and entrenched corruption undermines credible initiatives for reform. For ordinary citizens, this is not a matter of abstract policy, but of daily hardship, a reminder that political dysfunction is inseparable from economic survival. This point becomes even clearer when Nepal is set alongside its neighbors. The region as a whole faces corruption challenges, but some countries have managed to stabilize or improve their governance indicators, while Nepal has not. Understanding its place means looking beyond national borders, where patterns of stagnation and reform reveal how its problems compare to those of others in South Asia. How Nepal compares to its neighbors. When viewed through a regional lens, Nepal's corruption crisis takes on added significance. Corruption is not just a national challenge here. It is part of a broader South Asian pattern where weak oversight, entrenched patronage, and the dominance of elite networks frequently undermine governance. Yet regional comparisons matter because they show the degree to which some states have managed partial progress while others remain stuck. In Nepal's case, the story is one of persistent stagnation. The numbers from Transparency International's 2024 Corruption Perceptions Index, CPI, make this clear. Nepal scored 34 out of 100, placing it alongside some of the region's weaker performers. To put this into perspective, Bhutan stood well above its neighbors with a score of 72, while India scored 38. At the lower end, Sri Lanka came in at 32, Bangladesh at 23, and Afghanistan at just 17. China, often a regional point of reference, held 43. These figures do not describe corruption in precise quantities, but they measure how both citizens and observers perceive governance, trust, and the ability of states to enforce rules. And it is those perceptions that shape how donors, investors, and ordinary citizens judge the credibility of a political system. Nepal's position in this regional picture is revealing not because it is the worst performer. That distinction falls to Afghanistan or Bangladesh, but because it is stagnant. After years of protests, cabinet collapses, and promises of reform, its score has effectively flatlined. While neighbors move in divergent directions, Nepal stays tethered to the same spot. Sri Lanka, for instance, has plummeted into crisis, its corruption inseparable from its economic meltdown. Bangladesh manages to sustain rapid economic growth in exports despite poor governance, while India, despite recurring scandals, reassures investors through the resilience of its larger institutions. Bhutan stands as proof that strong enforcement is possible in the region. Its score of 72 demonstrates that accountability is not beyond reach in South Asia. That contrast is what cuts deepest for Nepalese. Bhutan shows results, Nepal shows repetition. Bhutan's comparison carries particular weight. Its smaller population and centralized governance structure make enforcement less complicated, but the policy choices matter. Officials there have faced investigation and prosecution when credible allegations surfaced, and the government has fostered a culture of transparency in budgeting and public service delivery. This vigilance reinforced public trust and international credibility. For ordinary Nepalese, Bhutan's record is difficult to dismiss as an outlier or an impossibility. It shows that effective enforcement is achievable within the region and counters the idea that South Asia as a whole is fated to low scores. Nepal's failure to replicate this is not due to a lack of awareness or political slogans. Leaders in Kathmandu announce reforms regularly, from campaign finance controls to new watchdogs. Yet the gap lies in enforcement. Commissions are formed, but rarely conclude with prosecutions. Oversight bodies exist, but are staffed by political insiders, undermining their independence. The result is that surveys feeding into the CPI repeatedly capture the same perception. The system does not punish graft, and those in power remain untouchable. While Bhutan demonstrates that credible enforcement shifts perceptions upward, Nepal illustrates how cosmetic reforms without enforcement lead to a plateau. That difference explains why the two countries, neighbors with shared geography and intertwined histories, occupy such different places in the 2024 index. Bangladesh offers another revealing point of contrast. Despite its low 2024 score of 23, the country has managed consistent economic expansion, particularly through textiles and exports, lifting millions out of poverty. This creates a paradox. Its people face systemic corruption, yet the economy generates growth and jobs. Nepalese looking across the border cannot help but note the uneven comparison. Their own country, with a higher CPI score, fails to generate similar opportunities. The perception grows that Bangladesh has at least managed to channel growth alongside dysfunction, while Nepal's stagnation delivers neither clean governance nor significant prosperity. For citizens, watching a neighbor lower on the index post higher growth drives a different kind of frustration. It raises the question of why corruption in Nepal seems only to produce paralysis rather than expansion. India, with its score of 38 in 2024, is frequently cited as a relevant benchmark. Corruption scandals in India extend from petty bribery to headline-grabbing procurement scams. However, India's institutions, courts, investigative bodies, media, and its large economy sustain enough credibility to retain investor confidence. Corruption remains, but the system functions in ways that allow stability. Investors and regional actors see Indian governance as flawed, but still reliable at scale. In contrast, Nepal at 34 signals neither resilience nor enforcement capacity. Its stagnation reflects weakness in both perception and reality. For foreign partners assessing risk, this is the distinction that matters. India absorbs pressure, Nepal struggles to absorb it. Sri Lanka and Afghanistan, meanwhile, operate on the margins of the comparison. Sri Lanka's 32 in 2024 reflects governance weakened by its economic collapse, reminding observers how corruption at the very top can accelerate instability nationwide. Afghanistan's 17 sits at the absolute bottom, a reflection of fractured institutions under conflict and poverty. For Nepal to exceed these two is not cause for pride, because the bar is so low. Beating out a war-torn state or a country enduring financial collapse is no achievement. For Nepalese, the comparisons that matter are upward, toward Bhutan's disciplined enforcement, India's relative stability, or at least toward the regional average that Nepal repeatedly fails to climb above. China's score of 43 provides one more layer to the context. Though outside South Asia, its influence in the region is unavoidable. Its anti-corruption campaigns, however criticized for political motivations, still demonstrate rigorous prosecution and headline-making punishments. Whatever the methods, such efforts improved perceptions noticeably above Nepal's. For Nepal, often economically dependent on China and India, that gap reinforces its vulnerability. Corruption stagnation not only undermines domestic trust, but weakens its position in negotiations with much stronger neighbors. Viewed from across South Asia, Nepal's distinctiveness comes not from being the worst or the most corrupt, but from its resistance to change. Protests have erupted, ministers have resigned, and parties have shuffled. Yet the CPI numbers remain locked in the mid-30s. Compare this to Bangladesh, which finds growth amid dysfunction, and Bhutan, which steadily builds clean governance systems. Nepal appears uniquely suspended, its politics neither collapsing fully nor generating progress, but circling in stasis. In strategic terms, this creates vulnerability. A state unable to enforce accountability is one that foreign donors approach cautiously, one that investors distrust, and one whose citizens migrate rather than build at home. This persistence of stagnation has direct security and geopolitical implications. When states prove unable to reform internally, external factors fill the gaps. Influence from larger neighbors or reliance on remittances and donor aid takes on disproportionate weight. Weak enforcement and low institutional trust make Nepal more exposed to instability than its score alone might suggest. For regional actors evaluating where shocks could most easily topple an already fragile balance, Nepal's static position signals high risk. Regional cooperation under forums like the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, SAARC, could, in theory, provide tools for improvement. Discourses on anti-corruption circulate in workshops and declarations, and models of policy transfer across member states are discussed. But in practice, implementation rarely follows. SAARC produces statements, not enforcement. Each state prioritizes its own politics, leaving little binding pressure for reform. For Nepal, that means there is no meaningful external driver pushing beyond the limited reforms produced domestically. Cosmetic change suffices because the neighborhood does not demand more. The strategic takeaway is clear. Bhutan's enforcement trajectory shows that progress is possible. Bangladesh demonstrates how corruption can coexist with growth in particular circumstances. India reflects resilience amid dysfunction, but Nepal's pattern, frozen in the mid-30s, unfazed by uprisings or reforms, leaves it in a uniquely precarious spot. It survives, but without strengthening. That survival without transformation is the risk. It can endure year to year, but remains exposed to sudden destabilization when economic or political shocks arrive. Perceptions data like the CPI is often criticized for subjectivity, but the significance lies in how it shapes action. Donors hesitate, investors doubt, and citizens disengage when they trust the system less. For Nepal, being locked at 34 is not just a statistic, it is a recurring signal to the world, the region, and its own people, that institutions remain too weak to enforce change. Stability that relies on inertia is fragile stability. The question, then, is how those perceptions intersect with the evolving tools used by citizens themselves. While traditional reforms have largely stalled, people have adapted by finding alternative spaces to channel their frustrations. In Nepal's case, one of the most important of those spaces has been digital. The digital battlefield, social media's power. By 2025, the contest over corruption and authority in Nepal extended beyond parliaments and streets into a new arena, the digital battlefield. Social media was no longer just a medium for sharing opinions. It had become a central terrain where the state attempted to restrict voices and where young citizens pushed back with equal force. Every government effort to regulate or suppress these spaces met with equally rapid adaptation and resistance from those who relied on them. Social platforms shaped politics in part because they compressed distance. With a smartphone, ordinary citizens could watch, comment, and organize simultaneously. A photo or short video captured more outrage and humor than any speech in Parliament. Hashtags like Nepo Kids became shorthand for resentment, channeling anger toward elites whose families flaunted privilege. One viral image, the son of a senior politician proudly posing before stacks of luxury brand boxes, crystallized inequality into a single meme. For young people juggling high unemployment and migration pressures, this contrasted their daily struggles with a snapshot of elite excess. Such images spread far faster than official rebuttals ever could. Organization followed naturally. What began with jokes and memes moved into encrypted messaging networks. Protest information, from meeting points to first aid contacts, flowed through decentralized channels that resisted state monitoring. Without a single leader to target, horizontal structures emerged, letting students, freelancers, and workers coordinate equally. Activists had studied international examples, Hong Kong's protest networks, Cairo's digital forums, and European climate movements. The result in Nepal was a leaderless but effective mobilization, one that bypassed political parties altogether and confirmed that resistance could be organized without central command. Government officials believed regulation could curtail these currents. In November 2023, the Ministry of Communication and Information Technology required platforms to register locally, appoint officers, and cooperate with police investigations. Framed as oversight, these demands gave the state new leverage to pressure companies into removing sensitive posts. Critics warn that vague definitions of illegal content risked criminalizing dissent. For youth organizers already skeptical of institutions, the rules appeared less about accountability and more about embedding censorship into law. Oversight blurred with control. The sharpest confrontation came in September 2025, when the government briefly blocked around 26 major platforms, including Facebook, X, YouTube, and Instagram. Officials said the move aimed to enforce new digital tax rules. Public opinion read the decision differently, an attack on dissent at the very moment fragile coalitions faced growing criticism. The consequences stretched beyond politics. Roughly half the country used these platforms daily, not only to connect, but to run businesses, market products, and sustain freelance incomes. With platforms responsible for an estimated 80% of national internet traffic, the ban disrupted livelihoods overnight. Ban right arrow livelihoods, cut right arrow viral outrage, right arrow street protests. The policy backfired almost at once. VPN downloads spiked dramatically, documented at increases of more than 8,000% within days. What began as a technical workaround quickly took on a symbolic meaning. Each installation represented a personal refusal to be silenced. Activists migrated to encrypted channels and alternative apps, keeping coordination alive in spaces the government could not easily police. The state had hoped to cut the line of communication. Instead, it fueled defiance and made networks more resilient. By cutting off both expression and income, the ban inflamed tensions that extended beyond students and activists. Shopkeepers reliant on Facebook advertising, freelancers working with international clients over YouTube or TikTok, and migrant families sharing remittance instructions over WhatsApp all found their communication suddenly interrupted. Criticism, already widespread because of corruption, expanded as civil liberties and basic livelihoods were now visibly at risk. Civil society groups that had remained cautious earlier now joined in condemning the policy as destructive and ill-conceived. Digital activism in 2025 had also matured compared to earlier protest waves. Outrage hashtags were now supported by layered strategies. Protesters shifted rapidly from one channel to the next when disruptions arose, distributed safety guidelines via cloud storage, and rerouted live streams through applications designed to evade national firewalls. Corruption remained the central grievance, but campaigns increasingly tied the fight to everyday issues like inflation, unemployment, and censorship. Social media, once just a site of venting, was now a structured resistance infrastructure. The government's responses could not match that adaptability. Blocking platforms without offering local alternatives only magnified the problem. Unlike China, where homegrown substitutes like WeChat and Weibo filled gaps, Nepal had nothing comparable to present. Citizens turned to black markets for VPN access, communities published guides on digital evasion, and state control became impossible to enforce. The result was paradoxical. Bans that were meant to silence opposition strengthened the symbolic power of banned platforms as sites of defiance. Generational misunderstanding deepened the standoff. Many older leaders regarded online conversations as trivial entertainment, not as integral to modern life. But for younger citizens, online networks were foundations of their livelihoods, activism, and education. To restrict these networks was not about limiting leisure. It was felt as an attack on social existence itself. The sharp intensity of protest to digital bans reflected this difference in perspective. To silence social media was to erase the means through which a generation connected to each other and the world. Over time, activists learned not only to adapt, but also to anticipate repression. If protests in 2018 relied largely on numbers and visibility, by 2025, strategies balanced secrecy with reach. Networks planned redundancies, layered anonymity, and shifted structures for sustainability. New crackdowns no longer halted activity, they reshuffled it into more sophisticated forms. The digital battlefield had hardened the movement, teaching participants how to withstand surveillance while amplifying their message globally. The unintended result was that the government, by banning platforms and imposing legal restrictions, undermined its own strategies. Attempts at control legitimized activists, warnings that leaders sought to silence criticism rather than govern responsibly. Each miscalculation bred more anger, more adaptation, and more creative resistance. For citizens, the contradiction was clear. A government unable to enforce its own bans, but determined to issue them anyway. What began as a struggle over hashtags and memes grew into a slow political recalibration. Social media turned into both a shield and a platform for economic survival, and therefore into a central line of confrontation between state authority and its citizens. The government declared control, but online voices not only survived, they reorganized into something more robust than before. And yet, when the barricades came down and protests receded, questions remained. The online clashes had been visible, disruptive, and symbolic, but they could not sustain permanent pressure on the streets. As Nepal moved past the dramatic weeks of September 2025, the visible energy of mass mobilization began to wane, raising a larger question about what comes after the noise. The youth-led movement, dormant or defeated. The youth-led movement in Nepal still hangs over the political landscape, not as an everyday presence, but as a memory that refuses to fade. The visible force that once filled Kathmandu's squares and toppled a prime minister has receded. Yet the deeper grievances, corruption, economic stagnation, limited opportunity, remain unresolved. This leaves a central dilemma. Has the movement been permanently neutralized, or is it simply quieted, waiting for another moment to rise? The answer lies in the contrast between the surface and what runs underneath. On the surface, large marches are less common now. Kathmandu's streets move through routine daily life, no longer barricaded, no longer consumed by confrontations with police. But beneath that calm, frustration continues to define the conversations of a generation. The lifting of the social media ban in late 2025 offered a narrow win, but few saw it as victory in the larger struggle. It corrected a flashpoint without erasing the deeper failures. For many young Nepalis, the lesson was bitter. You could overturn a ban, but you could not easily shift the architecture of corruption that sustained the old order. One of the lasting characteristics of the Gen Z protests was their rejection of Nepal's established political parties. Online campaigns ridiculed leaders across ideological lines, painting them all as participants in a system too compromised to be reformed. For those born after the Civil War or in its final phase, the old parties did not embody democratic victory, but dysfunction. This rejection was not apathy. It was a refusal to legitimize institutions that, in their eyes, had become vehicles for personal profit. That refusal continues long after marches ended, shaping how younger generations talk about politics and how little interest they hold in affiliating with traditional party structures. But if not with marches, how has that refusal expressed itself? Increasingly, through migration. By 2024, youth unemployment in Nepal reached about 20.8%. That left millions finishing school without clear prospects, watching as connections or bribes determined who secured jobs. Remittances, nearly one-third of the country's GDP, came to symbolize a path many felt they could not avoid. The Gulf states, Malaysia, South Korea, and India became destinations not of curiosity, but necessity. Migration was not only economic escape, it was also a vote of no confidence in Nepal's ability to provide for its citizens. For those who once protested loudly only to later board flights abroad, leaving was its own form of resignation. This exodus alters the pressure that protests once carried. Youth anger, when concentrated in Kathmandu, created paralysis for government leaders who could not dismiss street occupations. But anger dispersed into migration creates a quieter form of absence. The very generation that once mobilized for reform leaves behind elderly parents, children, or siblings, sending back money to sustain households but rarely contributing pressure at home. Economic survival is maintained, but political momentum softens. The country appears stable, yet this stability is produced by the departure of the disillusioned, not by transformation of what made them disillusioned. Beside those who remain, however, discontent still simmers. University classrooms are full of skeptical discussion. Cafes echo with jokes about corruption less as satire than survival. Even if the demonstrations are gone, the conversations keep returning to the same grievances. Why the hospitals run bare, why contracts collapse, why each new cabinet speaks of reform but delivers the same outcomes. The protests carry meaning as a memory that everyone recalls whenever these frustrations resurface. That memory matters because it signals potential. The silence of today is built on an awareness that collective anger can, under the right spark, return abruptly. The state has often mistaken this silence for compliance. Leaders speak as though the issue has passed, citing stability and a return to order. Yet activists working quietly inside campuses and community groups issue a different interpretation. For them, the pause is not peace, it is an interval. They point to the repeated pattern in Nepal's recent history. Long stretches of apparent calm, followed suddenly by disruption, triggered by one scandal larger than the rest or one reminder of elite impunity too stark to ignore. This is why many analysts argue that tranquility is fragile. It reflects temporary exhaustion, not reconciliation. Migration's role sharpens that fragility. If thousands choose departure as their solution, what does it mean for Nepal's manpower, for its foreign reserves built on remittances, and for its long-term security when so many of its youngest citizens construct futures elsewhere? It relieves short-term pressure by draining the streets, yet it hollows out the foundations of domestic renewal. Other nations in South Asia with poor corruption scores, like Bangladesh, anchor legitimacy in fast-growing industries. Nepal cannot claim the same. Its workforce exports do not substitute for job creation at home. Each graduating class faces the same calculation: stay and languish, or leave and support families through remittances. That calculation reinforces political cynicism. If young citizens are not applying to join parties, not staying to contest elections, not seeing hope in reforms, they translate their frustration into private strategies. In political terms, it means the cycle reproduces itself. Governments can ignore reforms without fearing election punishment because the most frustrated are either disengaged or absent abroad. But that absence is not permanent erasure. Cynicism can become combustible if those who remain feel cornered enough. Every crumbled road, every medicine shortage, every imposed fee keeps the wound open. This leads to the strategic dilemma at the heart of the question. The youth-led movement looks dormant from the outside, but the conditions that fueled it endure beneath the surface. Defeat, in a strict sense, requires closure. Yet in Nepal, nothing has been closed. Corruption continues, Unemployment persists and migration grows. What vanished was not the issues, but the immediate form of confrontation. Dormancy may describe it better than defeat. Contained anger exists, but it cannot be measured in marches at present. It is written instead in visa applications, foreign contracts, and the skepticism voiced at every news broadcast announcing reforms. For those in positions of authority, this should not read as triumph. Rather, it represents a temporary reprieve. Movements that appear quieted often carry the weight of memory, and memory has proven a volatile political resource. What happens if new scandals erupt in the same climate of absent opportunity? What happens if remittances, the very cushion for households, falter due to global downturns abroad? Quiet discontent has the potential to return in forms as unpredictable as it did in 2018 or 2025. The uncertainty is what keeps the idea of dormancy more accurate than defeat. Nepal sits, therefore, in an in-between state. Its young citizens have not abandoned frustration, but they have redirected it through migration, disengagement, or small forms of daily resistance rather than mass uprising. The state has survived not because of transformation, but because of dispersal. Yet systems that rely on dispersal remain vulnerable to sudden reconcentration. And when those frustrations concentrate again, the stability of institutions whose legitimacy is already thin will come under strain. This unresolved tension creates its own shadow across the political sphere. If the most energetic segment of the population is no longer trusted or is physically absent, who holds responsibility for safeguarding order when crises return? The answer, at least in practice, has been another institution that rises whenever politics falters. And its increasing visibility raises questions no less urgent than those posed by the protesters themselves. The military and the question of stability. The September 2025 protests forced Nepal's fragile political order to turn to the one institution that still projected authority: the army. When police units proved unable to contain the spiraling violence, after government buildings were torched and barricades paralyzed Kathmandu, President Ram Chandra Paudel authorized the army's deployment. Soldiers rolled into the capital, set up checkpoints, and imposed a curfew. The sequence was straightforward. Police lost control, the president intervened, and the army became the visible face of authority on the streets. For many Nepalese, this was less about a dramatic takeover and more about a sobering signal of where power actually resided when civilian governance faltered. The decision underscored a central shift in perception. Protesters dismissed the president as another product of a discredited elite, leaving his orders dependent on an institution they respected more than any politician. Images of armored vehicles at intersections and troops guarding ministries created an impression that security, not parliament, was the true guarantor of stability. Though no coup followed, the symbolism was potent. Civilian authority survived, but only with soldiers standing beside it. Military leaders, aware of the risks to their credibility at home and abroad, acted quickly to assert constitutional limits. Brigadier General Raja Rambasnit publicly dismissed talk of political ambition. He emphasized that the army was acting strictly within the constitution to normalize the situation and restore calm. Army Chief Ashok Raj Sigdal reinforced the same message, stressing that their mission was security, not governance. Their statements were designed to reassure. The state's chain of command remained formally intact, and the army's presence in the streets came with limits. Yet assurances could not erase the unease. Analysts noted that because President Paudel carried so little legitimacy with protesters, many Nepalese believed practical authority was coming directly from the men in uniform. Public policy expert Bishnu Raja described the army as de facto power during the emergency, a role confirmed not through official proclamations, but through sheer visibility. The distinction mattered. Whether or not the military intended to govern, its repeated deployment normalized the idea of the army as arbiter of order, expanding its political leverage even without crossing into a formal coup. The civilian government's weakness magnified this dynamic. While ministers in Parliament debated reforms and commissions, the curfew imposed by soldiers silenced the streets. For ordinary citizens navigating roadblocks on their way to markets and schools, the contrast was clear. Authority was not being exercised through politics, but through patrols. Shops reopened, and nightly arson declined once the army arrived. For many families, this was not experienced as repression, but as relief. The streets seemed safer under military watch than they had under civilian leadership stretched thin. That reassurance, in turn, built a reservoir of trust, making the army one of the few institutions with credibility across social divisions. But with trust came anxiety. The very fact that soldiers were welcomed as stabilizers raised questions about what would happen if they chose not to retreat once unrest subsided. Nepal's history of monarchy aligned closely with the army, its decade-long civil war, and repeated coalition collapses all prime society to see intervention as a real possibility whenever politics breaks down. The September protests intensified those memories. Rumors and fears of a potential coup circulated widely online, even though official voices dismissed such speculation. The circulation of those fears itself revealed something important. Democracy in Nepal was still fragile enough that a military-led future was always imaginable in the public mind. Academics tried to clarify the distinction. Yograj Lamichan of Pokhara University stressed that the army had not exercised administrative power, but had limited itself to restoring peace. His framing captured the paradox. Constitutional restraint was observed on paper, yet the experience on the ground tilted authority toward the barracks. Civilian politicians remained in place, but their dependency on soldiers deepened perceptions that governance was borrowed rather than earned. Among younger citizens, already skeptical of party politics, this visible reliance reinforced broader mistrust of elected institutions. Strategically, the pattern matters. Each crisis ends with a familiar formula. Cabinet leaders lose control, protests overwhelm the police, and the army imposes order. Afterwards, the institution withdraws, but the memory of its reliability lingers. Over time, this repetition accumulates into precedent. Even if not codified in law, the expectation forms that the army will step in at the next collapse. That expectation strengthens the military's leverage. Without openly ruling, it becomes the default arbiter that decides whether the state holds together. The military's own statements outlined both deterrence and caution. In September, it warned protesters that vandalism, arson, or attacks would be punishable crimes and promised strict responses. Yet in the same breath, it emphasized its role in preserving unity and encouraging dialogue. It projected firmness without ambition, offering stability while insisting it sought no authority beyond security. Those messages were necessary precisely because the institution understood how its presence altered the political balance. The contradiction was evident, denying power while exercising it in practice. Comparisons across the region sharpened the stakes. In Bangladesh and Pakistan, repeated civilian failures created openings for military regimes masked as temporary stabilizers. Nepal has not yet crossed that line, but its structural weaknesses resemble that instability. Fragile coalitions, a persistent trust gap, and cycles of street uprisings create the conditions in which repeated military deployments reshape the political landscape. The risk is not an immediate coup, but a gradual normalization of military oversight, making it harder for civilian rule to reclaim full credibility. Inside Nepal, views on this dependency remain divided. Some residents see the army as necessary insurance. As long as politicians bargain endlessly and institutions stall, soldiers are the only ones ensuring order. Others interpret it as dangerous dependence, warning that the more the public comes to expect military interventions, the weaker democracy becomes. Both assessments converge on one reality. The reliance itself signals civilian fragility. When citizens anticipate soldiers rather than politicians to solve crises, the system's fundamental legitimacy is in question. The September experience showed how quickly responsibility shifts in a moment of crisis. Parliament continued debating initiatives, But those debates felt distant from the practical reality enforced at checkpoints and curfew lines. Trust in governance tilted toward those with rifles, not those with seats in the chamber. That tilt underscores the structural dilemma facing Nepal. Whether a democracy can survive long-term when the institution most trusted to impose order is not elected, but uniformed. The army, for now, repeats its reassurances. It claims no stake in ruling, insists its mission ends when calm is restored, and withdraws once the streets return to routine. But withdrawal is never full. The institution lingers in the national imagination as guarantor of order, invited back each time protests threaten collapse. With each cycle, civilian credibility erodes, while the aura of military reliability expands. The weight of that reputation ensures the army's influence even in silence. Nepal's crisis in 2025 thus highlights a contradiction. Democracy survives formally, driven by elections and coalitions. Yet stability in practice depends on the readiness of soldiers to intervene at moments of breakdown. This duality leaves the future unsettled. If the political class fails to find enduring solutions, reliance on the military will continue to deepen, creating a democracy sustained not by institutions, but by an institution designed outside politics. As political leaders attempt once more to frame reforms and regain public confidence, a larger question emerges in the background. Can Nepal's fragile system still find a way out of this cycle? Is change still possible? For Nepal in 2025, the crucial discussion is not only about how protests shook the state, but about whether they can produce lasting change. The demonstrations were not limited to demanding resignations or temporary reshuffles. They went further, questioning the framework itself. For many young activists, replacing one leader after another within the same structure had proven futile. If corruption and instability kept recurring, the institutions themselves had to be redesigned. That question, whether the system can be rebuilt rather than patched, sits at the center of Nepal's politics today. Among the most visible proposals were reforms that protesters framed as essential to building accountability. These included setting term limits for the office of Prime Minister, reducing the parliamentary cycle from 5 years to 4, and introducing direct elections for the head of government. Reporting at the time emphasized these as core protest demands. The logic behind them was straightforward. Shorter terms would reduce stagnation, term limits would stop elites from entrenching themselves indefinitely, and direct elections would give citizens, not party backroom deals, final authority in choosing a leader. Protest leaders argued that if the top office were made directly accountable to voters, then the web of coalition bargaining that has paralyzed Nepal repeatedly might finally give way to a more decisive style of governance. Supporters of these reforms came not only from the streets, but also from academia and civil society. Scholars pointed out that Nepal's parliamentary bargaining structure has produced near-constant instability, with governments collapsing before reforms can take root. Comparative examples outside Nepal were raised to show how direct election systems sometimes reduce deadlock, or how clear term limits restrict elite capture. Experts did not claim these reforms were guaranteed solutions, but they noted that systems built on clearer, more direct mandates tended to withstand coalition churn better than Nepal's current framework. What reformers were demanding was not novelty for its own sake, but tried and tested ways of strengthening accountability. Still, the challenge was that reform energy surged in the streets, but thinned in institutional settings. The movement was deliberately leaderless, priding itself on horizontal organization and collective action. This advantage allowed it to overwhelm police lines and mobilize thousands in Kathmandu quickly, but it carried weaknesses as well. Leaderless energy can topple governments, but usually lacks mechanisms to codify reform. Without leadership structures, protests risked being absorbed by the same political forces they opposed. The discord-based polls that elevated Sushila Karki as interim prime minister captured this tension precisely. a striking demonstration of creativity and digital organization, yet procedurally fragile in terms of legality or long-term legitimacy. The lesson many analysts drew was that outrage could displace, but not necessarily replace, entrenched structures. Kaki's appointment illustrated both the promise and the complication. As Nepal's first female prime minister and a figure with a background in reform, her initial cabinet included independence-minded professionals intended to restore confidence. Many saw this as a serious attempt to reconnect government with citizens, yet her rise was also contested. Parliament had been burned in violent protests, traditional parties were bypassed by online polls, and the army's consultation in stabilizing the transition raised questions about how formal the process actually was. Supporters called it innovative democracy. Critics viewed it as unstable improvisation. This mixture of hope and unease reflected how fragile Nepal's trajectory remained, even under figures selected to symbolize reform. At the heart of the issue is a dual path. On one hand, the state can continue as before, with coalitions splintering, elites recycling offices, and corruption tolerated as inevitable. Protests would then become periodic performances, briefly shaking governments, changing leaders, but leaving the institutional machine untouched. Citizens would resign themselves to stagnation, and migration would remain the rational choice for youth who saw no way forward inside the country. On the other hand, structural reform could break the cycle. Term limits, direct elections, and independent oversight would not make Nepal immune to corruption, but they would constrain it, forcing elites to recognize that office no longer equates to endless personal enrichment. For this second path to materialize, however, protest energy must convert into legislative frameworks, not just disruption. Some activists recognize this trade-off. They note that while mass action can force resignations, transforming the system requires committees, drafting, negotiation, and above all, enforcement. Laws must move from slogans into functioning institutions, and bodies meant to police corruption must be protected from capture. Without these protections, even new laws would remain cosmetic. This is why scholars stress that building independence into watchdog agencies matters as much as restructuring the Prime Minister's office. No reform will endure without mechanisms insulated from elite bargaining. Citizens themselves sit at the heart of this unresolved equation. They live the failures daily: underfunded hospitals, crumbling infrastructure, and employment opportunities corrupted by favoritism. For many, reforms are not philosophical debates, but practical necessities. Term limits sound abstract until one realizes they could prevent another decade of revolving promises from the same figures. Direct election may sound procedural, but becomes urgent when existing coalitions collapse every few months. Yet ordinary citizens also carry skepticism. They have heard speeches of reform before, watched ministers resign, and read reports of accountability that led to nothing. Each cycle of hope and disappointment thickens doubt. For change to take root, citizens say they need proof in outcomes, not rhetoric. Skepticism is reinforced by migration. With youth unemployment at about 20.8% in 2024 and remittances making up roughly one-third of national GDP, immigration has become not only an economic strategy, but a form of political disengagement. Those who leave express their frustration not at rallies, but at airports. For the state, this drain relieves immediate street pressure, but damages long-term reform capacity. Energy that might build institutions instead funds households abroad, leaving domestic politics quieter but unresolved. Kaki's interim administration is therefore both symbol and test. If it cannot institutionalize reform, skepticism will deepen. If it demonstrates capacity, even in limited ways, belief in systemic change could recover. For now, her position remains precarious, viewed by many as necessary, but by others as illegitimate, sustained only by a balance of protest expectations and coalition bargaining. The fragility itself illustrates how deeply change must run if it is to endure. The broader lesson from 2025 appears clear. Nepal cannot substitute improvisation for stability. Protest energy must learn to embed itself in legal frameworks, and coalitions must accept rules that limit their discretion. Without this, cycles of defiance and erosion will repeat. History has shown that popular movements can topple kings, prime ministers, and party leaders in Nepal. The harder question is whether they can sustain institutions that prevent corruption from rebuilding itself. That brings us to one last reflection. The protests already shifted the conversation, elevating systemic reform ideas, once confined to academic reports, into nationwide debates. Millions now speak about direct elections, term limits, and shorter parliamentary cycles, as though they were plausible futures rather than abstract hypotheticals. The potential exists for these slogans to become laws, but only if political will and institutional capacity meet the demands of the street. And so the unresolved question lingers. Will these demands be locked into law and enforcement, or remain slogans waiting for the next round of protests to revive them? Nepal's trajectory in 2025 highlights the gulf between demands for reform and the realities of power. The Transparency International Index still places the country at 107th of 180 with a score of 34, showing that perceptions of corruption remain unchanged. At the same time, youth unemployment hovers around 20.8%, and remittances make up about 1/3 of GDP, evidence of a society propped up by migration rather than domestic opportunity. Overlaying this is the military, repeatedly deployed as the stabilizer whenever politics unravels, raising longer-term risks for democratic legitimacy. Which matters more for stability, structural reform, economic opportunity, or the army's role? Tell us in the comments. Nepal's streets have quieted, but its strategic fault lines have not, and that matters beyond its borders.